I have for decades daily debated defenders of the faith, even though they never had any actual factual evidence nor logically valid arguments either. It's always just the same old set of erroneous assumptions, distortions, and emotional nonsense endlessly repeated on an infinite loop. There is no truth to any faith, and nothing any of them can show that they got more accurate than every other faith. And they can't even collectively show that there's a there, that there even is a supernatural at all. All any of them ever had are frauds, falsehoods, and fallacies. Now, over the years, I've noticed that every logical fallacy has been used as an argument for God, and that every argument for God is a logical fallacy. Like the question-begging fallacy, which is ubiquitous in every faith. Circular arguments routing back to an already assumed conclusion, wherein the sacred conclusion must be reached even if there's no rational way to get there. And a true believer will never admit their failure there either. At most, they'll just change the subject with a red herring. Even the best arguments for God are fallacious, like the Kalam cosmological argument promoted by William Lane Craig, or Aquinas' argument for a necessary being, a favorite among Muslims. These are syllogisms in which not only are the premises not necessarily true, but the conclusion is a non sequitur, often depending on terms being misdefined, such that if you define truth incorrectly and you define God incorrectly too, well, then you can define God as truth and thus define your God into being. Not in any real sense, of course, just through the power of your own misunderstanding. If you use enough unfamiliar terms or concepts, maybe you can confuse someone else into sharing your delusion. That's about as much as apologists can do. That's how intelligent design proponents convinced Antony Flew, who was a philosopher, not a biologist. He didn't adequately understand evolution, and he was suffering dementia. But creationists still take that as a win. And one of the most annoying fallacies for me personally is the fallacy of false equivalence, in which we are told that atheism is a religion, or that evolutionism is the religion of atheism, and that science relies on faith just like religion does, and that science is biased just like religion is, and that there's no evidence for evolution, Big Bang, abiogenesis, etc., as if they ever cared about evidence. And then they'll say that there is evidence for creation, Noah's flood, God, etc., and then they assert that that religion is logical and reasonable, just like science, and that religion can be confirmed empirically and experimentally, just like science, and that consequently creationism is scientific. Now, these are all lies, of course, but they're all fallacious too. And the first half of these could also be interpreted as the tu quoque fallacy, the argument that you're just as bad. They're an attempt to share the blame. Think of when a child argues that he shouldn't be convicted of a crime because Timmy did it too. And the latter half of these baseless assertions are false equivalence turned into an oxymoron. That's when apparently contradictory terms appear in conjunction, like in the title of William Lane Craig's book, Reasonable Faith. There's no such thing as reasonable faith, because we understand that faith is an unreasonable conviction that is assumed without reason and defended against all reason. But religious apologists take it even further, and please forgive my reference to an old and probably racist colloquialism, the pot calling the kettle black, in which they're both black, but the pot doesn't want you to notice that it's black too, as if you're expected to accept that the kettle is guilty, but somehow not the pot. However, religious apologists take that lie even further, projecting their own faults onto those who will not share them. And this was one of the first fallacies I noticed when debating believers around about Y2K. And it's one that comes up in every single argument. When the believer accuses the unbeliever of the very thing that the believer alone is doing. So when I recognized this, I described it as the pot calling the silverware black. And a more modern interpretation of that is when we recognize that their every accusation is a confession. Now it's more like Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Turek uses the correct definition of faith, which is a weird admission for a creationist, and he distances himself from faith, implicitly admitting that he already knows that faith is dishonest, but he misdefines atheism and misrepresents science as well in order to shift the burden of proof, which is another logical fallacy, as if it is no longer incumbent on the claimant to substantiate their assertion, but up to the unbeliever to disprove it. That is as backward as being considered guilty until proven innocent, when it is impossible for the court to prove innocence. And therefore, it must needs be the other way around. It is not up to the unbelievers to disprove every unsupported assertion of impossible absurdity that some delusional drug addict dreamt up out of nothing. No, if you say that something is true, you need to substantiate it. And Hitchens' razor reminds us that positive claims require positive evidence, and that what is asserted without evidence may be dismissed without evidence. There is no burden of proof on those who reject baseless assertions. The point is that Turek is projecting his own fault, his faith, onto atheists, even though he knows that we reject faith and that everyone knows that he is a man of faith. So he's lying both about who he is and what our position is. And we commonly see this with presuppositionalists, who even go so far as to describe rationalism as irrational. How can rationalism be irrational? That's not only a violation of the law of non-contradiction, in which a thing cannot be both itself and also not itself, or the opposite of itself. It's also another Orwellian oxymoron, using the childish argument of "I'm rubber, you're glue," such that when I'm arguing with the religious extremists, they seem to pretend as if they're the science-minded, skeptical intellectual, and I am somehow the uneducated, faithful believer in dogmatic doctrine. It's like when it's like if you were to come into a chess game that's already mostly played out, and they realize they're on the losing side and just turn the board. That's what that logic seems like to me. And thus, every debate with a religious conservative over whether we believe is logically flawed, and every debate with a creationist is scientifically flawed. And they can't show you any truth to their position, and that should be enough. You shouldn't say that anything is true or the truth until or unless you can show the truth of it, the evidence leading to that conclusion. If you can't show that it's true at all, then why are you saying that it is? You don't know that, so you can't honestly claim it. But faith often means pretending to know what you don't know. So it doesn't bother them that whatever they're saying isn't evidently true, nor logically possible either. And it doesn't even bother them when we can immediately prove that it's false, which we usually can, and pretty easily, and I mean right now. Now, even when there was no reason to believe it, or the reason they thought they had turns out to be wrong, they're still going to believe it anyway, even when they already know that it's not really true. And the sad thing is that it's not just religious faith. Politics, too, can be even less rational than religion, and just as stubborn, just as pig-headed and opinionated and oblivious to any fact that contradicts what some might rather believe. Because in both cases, we're talking about issues of morality and manipulation of the masses and what our government is going to do to or for certain people. And the only significant difference is that politics is real. You don't need faith to believe that governments exist. We can also show data, legislation, statistics, charts, graphs, showing who did what when, as well as what worked and what didn't and why. Not that everyone listens, because politics, like religion, can be, and for some it is, a matter of tribal identity, based more on prejudice against misunderstood labels than on any actual consideration of policy. And of course, I'm talking about our currently dangerously polarized political powder keg, which I feel compelled to talk about because I have to do whatever I still can to try to save our republic from the destruction promised by over 100 conservative organizations who have signed on to Project 2025. It's a manifesto that, in summary, threatens to literally destroy our constitutional republic and replace our bureaucratic checks and balances with criminally corrupt oligarchs and unqualified loyalists to a dictator with absolute immunity. That description given in their 920-page manifesto ensures that this restructuring will cost all of our constitutional rights, at least those in the First Amendment. And more about that in a moment. If we're talking politics with ideological conservatives, then since political situations are indeed real, then there's at least the possibility that they could get something right sometimes, but often not even then. Extreme believers typically will still get everything upside down or backwards. Like when they say that everything the U.S. did wrong in our response to 9/11 was somehow Obama's fault, even though George W. Bush was president at the time and Obama wasn't anyone yet. And similarly, inflation, which began as a result of the pandemic and was exacerbated by Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and both events were global in their effects, such that no American president could be blamed for every other country's economy. They still give Trump the credit for anything good, even when he did nothing good. And they blame Biden for global inflation that was already a problem before he was elected. And they won't even acknowledge that we got inflation back down to about 3% in the US, such that our economy is actually doing better right now than anyone else's. Trump inherited a good economy, which was projected to continue through his term, and it had only underperformed a little bit before COVID. Yet his fans still credit him for Obama's economy, which took a while to build after correcting for Bush's mistakes. And they give Trump a pass for failing his pandemic response. It's a double standard based entirely on emotions, not actual data. Because they whine that right now unemployment is at a 50-year high, when really it's at a 50-year low. And conservatives are always complaining that crime is ever on the rise, yet the data shows the opposite trend, with violent crimes especially more or less consistently diminishing over the last few decades, with another profound drop just last year to the lowest points it's been in the last 50 years. But again, the facts don't matter. Remember when Obama was going to take our guns away? Remember when the right-wing media said that in the second month of the second term, Obama was going to take all our guns away and load us all into trains bound for FEMA camps? And that was supposed to prevent us from voting for Obama, of course. But then when that didn't happen, it's like, oh, we didn't say that. And now that he's not president anymore, we can say that that prediction failed, but they still think he's going to do it because they think Obama is still the one pulling Biden's strings, as if Obama is still the president, except that they think that Trump is still the president too, and that both of them are secretly locked in a power struggle against each other, just like God versus Satan. And the irony of that is that this has become a matter of identity politics, in the sense that conservatives consider Republican to be their identity more commonly and more deeply than do Democrats or anybody else. Every Democrat I know wants to fix the problems in our own party, where almost all the Republicans I know want to add to the growing list of issues in and coming from their party. For example, I don't worship Joe Biden. He is deeply flawed, and I would have chosen 5 other candidates over him. But these MAGA conservatives really do worship Trump. They think he is a literal godsend. And some of them have even taken Trump as their Messiah, complaining that Jesus is too woke. Texas Republicans, I've heard in a political rally, this one speaker said that they are born into the Republican Party and that they owe their party loyalty as a birthright. It doesn't matter what the policies are. Just vote for whichever convicted fraud and or rapist has an R next to their name. In Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership, they say that in the late 1970s, that was the moment when the political right unified itself and led the United States to historic political, economic, and global victories, which I interpret to mean that that's when conservative groups more actively impeded, retarded, or reversed progress in every application, especially in education and social justice. Whenever things get better, not just for rich, straight, white Christian men exclusively, but for everyone across the board, I would call that progress. But they call it decline, social decline, and they whine about the horrors of multiculturalism, refusing to be considerate of anyone else. This is my country, damn it. And this is where they contrast Americans versus other ethnicities, as if America is an ethnicity and an exclusively white one. And they say that the Reagan administration was when things started getting better for them. And I see Reaganomics as the catalyst, creating a domino effect of cascading economic failure, taking us to where we are now. Where to live as well as we once did, we now have to earn at least 5 times as much because everything costs 10 times more than it used to. And as an aside, I should share this. I mean, I remember back in the 80s, I went to go see Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest. And it was $15 to get in, and there were dollar drafts. And then 5 years ago, I went to go see Ozzy and Judas Priest. Only it was $150 to get in and $10 for a beer. So everything is 10 times as much, but we're not making 10 times as much. And then I remember that by the 1990s, these conservatives began their crusade to undermine science and integrate church and state and empower corporations to act like they're people. Everything the founding fathers tried to prevent. I don't worship the founders either, though I acknowledge that these men of enlightenment were especially well educated on exactly these topics. They warned us not to infuse government with religion, nor with corporations either. But as Orwell showed us in his book Animal Farm, over time, the evils that be will slowly erode our protections little bit by little bit. And if they get their foot in the door, they'll force in a lot more. Then the George W. Bush administration sounded like the audiobook of Orwell's more famous book, 1984, where the formation of Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, sounded a lot like the phrase that war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. And now things have just gotten worse. Remember that these people argue that if we teach about the racism in American history, whether it's the civil rights movement or the cause of the Civil War, these Orwellian conservatives, at least the white ones, will complain that these lessons are themselves reverse racism, that it would somehow be racist for students to learn that American history was so heavily tainted by racism. It used to be that if you were woke, that meant that you were aware of how certain demographics in this country, whether women, minorities, queer folk, etc., had more issues to deal with socially and professionally than straight white Christian men. And being aware that a problem exists, even if it's not your problem, you're aware that other people have this thing to consider that maybe is not such a big issue for you, but you don't want to contribute to it. You don't want to make it worse. That's a position of consideration and compassion. But these Orwellian conservatives have made compassion into a bad thing. In fact, they say that being considerate of other people's problems is somehow the absolute worst thing anyone can do. But it gets even worse, because many of these Orwellian conservatives don't know enough about politics to understand that even their political identities are not what they think they are. For example, the leader of the so-called Law and Order Party is a convicted felon, as are many of his former cabinet, several of whom are still in prison. And several more of these congressmen are going up against various felony charges. And they didn't care about the other crimes that Trump committed for which he was impeached twice either. They knew he was guilty. They just weren't going to hold him responsible, because the party of personal responsibility doesn't care that their president lied over 30,000 times while in office. They don't care that he cheats at golf, that he cheats at his taxes, that he cheats at his employees, that he cheated in the last election, and that his associates have already recently admitted, when they didn't realize they were being recorded, about how he is already trying to cheat the next election too. And they don't care that he cheated on all of his wives, to fornicate and adultery and pornography. They brag about their Christian values, but have you noticed that these values really are just prejudicial intolerance? Their moral values are when they pretend not to indulge in anything that looks, feels, or tastes good. Their family values are just hatred of queer folk. Their Christian values are just intolerance of everyone else, including most other Christians. And their American values are just racism. Republicans call themselves the party of Lincoln, as contrasted with the Democrats, who were once considered to be the party of the Ku Klux Klan. But that was a century ago. In the 1960s, there was the Southern strategy, wherein the parties swapped positions on several policies, such that the Klan is officially Republican now, with their leadership endorsing Donald Trump, which should surprise no one anymore. Then there's the Patriot Party, and all those who call themselves patriots, but who really were on January 6th and still today engaged in an attempt to overthrow our republic, to end everything our Constitution stood for. Insurrectionists are not patriots, and patriots would not have attempted an insurrection. They say that they're for small government, and they say, I worship the state. But remember that these people advocate for stop and frisk profiling, where all of your papers better be on you and in order at all times, just like it used to be in the Soviet Union. I want a smaller and weaker government than they do. If you believe in personal liberty, then remember that these ideological conservatives want the biggest, most intrusive, restrictive, and oppressive government one can imagine, one that monitors, legislates, and regulates or prohibits even the most intimate aspects of your private life and personal identity. So now they're back to just projecting all of Trump's faults onto Biden. So I was told a couple of days ago that every fucking thing in all caps that I say that Trump will do is exactly in all caps what Biden is already doing, except that it's not me saying that. It's the conservative mandate for leadership saying what they will do for Trump so that he doesn't have to do anything. We know what those things are, how anti-American all of those things are, and we know that the Biden administration is not interested in doing any of those things. Quite the opposite. But how do you reason with someone out of an unreasonable belief? So they tell me that Biden is incompetent after 50 years of political experience. Well, the only thing Trump is good at is bankrupting business after business, even money laundering casinos that you think couldn't possibly fail and wouldn't fail without utter incompetence bringing it down. That's every business Trump ever owned. Even though Biden has only one close relative with a criminal conviction, a son who is not involved in his administration, and is apparently not going to get a pardon from daddy either, I am told that that's the Biden crime family. But the Trump family business was fraud, and they were fined millions for it. Although the kids only got a slap on the wrist each, that's still a crime family. And they tell me that Biden shits himself. But Donald von Schitzenpants is the one who reportedly stinks, according to many witnesses. He's the one known to wear diapers and whose flatulence is famous in courtrooms and boardrooms. And then they tell me that Biden has dementia and that he doesn't know where he is and that he can't finish a sentence simply because he stuttered a bit all of his life. But Trump is the one who keeps forgetting where he is. Is this Sioux Falls? Is this Sioux City? And he interrupts himself. And he frequently displays phonemic paraphasia, which alarms psychiatrists as it is a known symptom of dementia. And he's running for president. Yeah, one of our presidential candidates apparently has dementia, and it's not the one you're saying it is. But the more important thing to understand is what is really at stake in this election is our Constitution and the republic for which it stands, especially the First Amendment, because Trump has tried to undermine every provision thereof. And he's even said that he should be allowed to change the parts that he doesn't like. And Putin did that with the Constitution of the Russian Federation, granting himself more power, at which point the entire Russian government quietly resigned. I don't think many Americans know that because we don't pay attention like we should, but that happened. So let's read the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Trump has already contradicted both of these. For one thing, he's many times parroted conservative views on establishing Christianity as the state religion, and Project 2025 promises to infuse Christian nationalism into the next conservative administration. They want to make this a Christian country, and the leaders of Project 2025 also are heads of other organizations whose mission goal is the Christianization of America. And that is a violation of the Establishment Clause. And then Trump's repeated calls to ban Muslim immigrants and other things like that are a violation of the Prohibition Clause. Now, moving on to the next line. Or abridging, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. To quote the ACLU, Trump has made it very clear that he doesn't stand for freedom of the press. As a presidential candidate, he told supporters he would open up the libel laws to sue journalists. We're going to have people sue you like you never got sued before, he promised. Trump, the candidate, also blacklisted reporters and entire news outlets from campaign events, referred to journalists as scum and slime, and mocked a reporter for having a disability. He vowed to sue women who reported incidents of sexual harassment and assault, along with outlets that covered their accounts, and threatened a lawsuit against a Hispanic journalist group for calling out his bigoted remarks. I would never kill them, but I do hate them, he said of reporters, and some of them are such lying, disgusting people. To quote the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights, Trump's attacks are strategic, designed to undermine confidence in reporting and raise doubts about verifiable facts. The president has labeled the media as being the enemy of the American people, very dishonest or fake news, and has accused the press of distorting democracy, of spreading conspiracy theories and blind hatred. These attacks run counter to the country's obligations to respect press freedom and international human rights law. To quote Harvard Kennedy School, President Donald Trump accused the press of being an enemy of the American people. Attacks on the media had been a hallmark of Trump's presidential campaign. But this charge marked a dramatic turning point. Language like this ventured into dangerous territory. 20th century dictators, notably Stalin, Hitler, and Mao, had all denounced their critics, especially the press, as enemies of the people. Their goal was to delegitimize the work of the press as fake news and create confusion in the public mind about what's real and what isn't, and what can be trusted and what can't be. And all of this implies that if Trump gets elected again, we will no longer have a free press. We will instead have only state-controlled right-wing propaganda channels like Fox News and OAN. And finally, on the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Now, I mentioned this in another video recently, but it bears repeating. Remember that just shortly before Trump was elected, there was a long standoff between a predatory oil pipeline violently attacking and oppressing the Sioux Nation at Standing Rock on the border between North and South Dakota. Obama was invested in this pipeline, and so was Hillary, and so was Trump. And not a lot of people knew that this was going on because these people were invested in it, and it wasn't a good look. I was there to see with my own eyes what corporate greed would do to the people who literally got in the way with psyops and rubber bullets and the like. There were no network news channels getting in there, only little internet news agencies like Democracy Now! So the only news made it out was by way of social media, until, amusingly, the Justice League arrived to help. The actors who played Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Cyborg showed up to get a little publicity out. And then Mark Ruffalo, who played the Hulk in the MCU, showed up too with a massive solar power generator so that everyone could charge their phones. Then when we found out the Sioux Nation was going to be defended in court by none other than Aaron Brockovich, Obama finally realized there's no way to keep the publicity off of this, and he caved to the Army Corps of Engineers, who pulled the plug. If Hillary had won the election, she would have stood by that decision, but Trump won. And not only did he immediately and illegally reverse it, resuming construction, which of course resulted in multiple oil spills, polluting the only available water supply in the area, but Trump also sent in law enforcement to clear out the protesters, and he tried to expand an existing law such that it would have become illegal to protest commercial construction projects. And remember that this is the same guy who 4 years ago ordered the police to tear gas a crowd who were protesting police brutality. What do you think Trump will do if he gets to use the military to shut down every protest, which is part of the Project 2025? They want to give him military to use against American civilians as police, just like North Korea. And Trump has already said that he wants to do this, that this would give him the chance to do what he always wanted to do. He wanted to change parts of the Constitution however he wants. Other provisions of Project 2025 would allow that too, regardless of what the Supreme Court says. So that under Trump, your right to peaceably assemble to petition the government for redress of grievances will look more like the massacre at Tiananmen Square. So there go your rights under the First Amendment, all of them. And you might think that if they don't make it this time, that in the next election cycle, they'll just try again, and they will. They've been trying since Reagan. However, what I read from the actual project manifesto says that they see this election as their last good chance to actually do it. So if we can beat them this time, and the only way to do that is to vote for Joe Biden, then we can save the republic, and then we can immediately fix a whole lot of other issues to better defend against the next such threat from enemies foreign, but especially from enemies domestic.